Okay, now we're going to take a look at the Layers panel, which is a very important panel within Photoshop, and there's a lot you can do with it, and we're going to kind of go over it right now. First thing I want to do is just go to File, New, and I'm just going to create with a preset of 8 by 10 with a resolution of 300, just to give us something to work with, and click OK. And now we got this document right here, and I'm going to make our Layers panel a little bit larger so we can work with it and see a little bit better what's kind of going on. First thing you notice is we have that background layer, which is caused because we are using a color as a background and we're not using transparency. So if we want to edit this background layer, we have to double click and then we can give it a layer name. I'm going to stay with layer 0, but one thing we can take a look at is the color. We can change this color to red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, and gray. So let's just select blue, and we have a mode, and now these are our blending modes. I'm not going to change this just yet, but I'm going to show you how these work out in just a minute. And we can also change our opacity. So there's the transparency of that layer, how much we can see through it, how opaque it is. I'm going to leave that at 100% right now and just click OK. When I click off this layer into this gray area, you can see that we have this blue bar right here. Well, that's the color of our layer. You also notice we have a very large thumbnail preview, so I can change these thumbnail previews by right mouse clicking in this gray area and either selecting no thumbnail or selecting small, medium, or large. We can also clip thumbnails to layer bounds and clip thumbnails to document bounds. Usually clip thumbnails to document bounds is the default, and it's usually pretty much the best way to view it. I'm going to change this back to large thumbnails so we can actually see what we have here. And you notice we have some more options on the top. Up here on the top it says normal. Well, these are our blending modes. The same thing we had when we were editing that first layer. Well, we can change them at any time. So nothing is finite when you're actually editing those layer properties. We also have the opacity up here, and then the fill, which I'll go over in just a little bit. And then on the top we can lock transparent pixels. In other words, I'll show you that in just a sec. Let's pull something up for a demonstration of the transparency. So I'm going to create a box shape and just draw that out on the shape tools. And I'm going to go up to the layer panel where we can see we have the mask and the shape, and right mouse click and go to rasterize layer. Now I'm going to lock the transparency on that layer. And it doesn't look like it really did much. We can move this around. We can also see the transparency in the background if you take a look at the thumb. We can see that that is there. But let's try painting on this object. I'm going to change this to red. And let's try painting in this transparency area. And you can see that nothing shows up in the transparency area. Well, where we have this shape, we can bring our brush over that and paint that and fill that in. So it's a way of restricting what you already have transparent and what you know is the edge of the document bounds within that layer. And then you can just paint over that. Or this also works for editing, running filters. Let's go up here and just run a quick filter, stylize, find edges, and you'll see that it only does it within that part of the area. Of course, there's nothing really around it that would have shown up with that filter, but you can see that it sticks to the transparency. Blur is probably a better representation of that. So let's go to blur, Gaussian blur, and now normally this would blur out the whole image and you would see the sides being blurred out, but with transparency on it stays a crisp edge. So if we go ahead and turn that off, run that Gaussian filter again, you'll see that it blurs the edges. So this is a nice little thing to have if you want to keep your transparency where it's at. And I'll just delete those history states. And let's take a look at some of the other options we have here. We have lock image pixels. We can also do that as well, besides using the transparency. So in other words, right now I cannot edit anything. So it's a good way of locking your image just for specific things. And then we can also lock the layer entirely so that we cannot edit it at all. We cannot move it. And if I try to, it says could not complete your request because the layer is locked. So we can lock our layers. So if we know exactly or if we know that the layer is exactly where we want it to be and we don't want to edit it, then we can just lock that. And it gives us a lot to sort of play around with. And then we also have lock position. So in other words, now I just can't move it, but I can still edit this layer and draw on it like normal. I just can't move it around. So we can keep getting those errors. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that off and right mouse click and go to delete layer and select yes. Now let's take a look at some of the other options we have. If we go up to the upper right and click this little arrow up here, we have docked palette wall, which will dock this up here along with the brushes, the tool presets, and the layer compositions. We can create a new layer up here, and then this gives us our same layer options that we had before. We can create a new layer. We can also duplicate a layer. If we already have one created, we just want to make a copy of it. We can delete the layer, delete hidden layers. We can create groups as well. And I'm going to show you the groups right now. I'm just going to go ahead and copy these, just like we did before, just to make a couple of copies of this layer, which is probably the easiest way to do it. And I'm going to select the top layer, select the tab up at the top, a little arrow, and select new group. And now we can give it a group name. I'm just going to leave it the default group 1, but I'm also going to give it a color of red. And the mode is pass through, which is what you're going to want to have as the default for this. But of course, we can always change those options later, and we'll leave our opacity at 100%. Click OK. So now we have this group in here, and you can see there's a little tab on the side. But what we can do is actually drag our layers into this group if we wanted to separate them. So I'm going to hold down Shift and select the bottom layer now, so we have all of these selected, and click and drag it into that group. And now we can expand the group if we want to, or decrease it so it's collapse it so it's smaller. In this way, we can work with multiple groups within an object, so we could have all the text in one group and all of the other pieces of the image that we're working on in another group. And then we can just create new groups as we go along, and it's a great way for sorting things. And it makes it much easier when we're working with hundreds of layers, so that we can separate those layers so we don't have to go through a couple hundred layers to look for maybe one text object. And this way we can have it all separated into groups and even groups within groups. So I could go ahead and actually expand group 1, go in here, create another group, group 3, within group 1, and then I can drag other layers into that group so we can have that all separated as well. And that way we can just collapse an entire set of layers. So it's a really neat tool to have, really neat options that you have there within the layer panel to help you out when you're designing or editing. So I'm just going to go here now and delete these groups, group and contents. And in this case, since we don't really have anything else, I'm going to drag this layer out and select this group, right mouse click, and delete group. Now we can delete the group only so it preserves our layers. So these layers will still exist, and so will this group. Or we can delete the group and its content, so everything in the group as well as the group. So I'm going to do that. And now we're back to one of these original layers that's just white. We can turn that on and off with our little eye on the side here. And that works with any layer. Now let's come down to the bottom of our layer panel, where we have a trash bin that we can pull this into. Of course, this is the only layer right now, so it won't let me do that. So I'm going to copy this layer, and you'll see that now the trash bin is no longer gray, and we can click, drag it down to the trash, and that will delete that layer. So it's kind of a neat thing you can do. And duplicate it again. We can also create a group just by clicking down here, which is kind of a hotkey for it. So it's much quicker, so we don't have to go in and go up to the top, new group, and then get the settings. It'll just automatically create a group, and then we can edit that if we want to. Right mouse click, go to group properties, change the name, which channels it affects. If you want to separate channels in groups, you can do that as well. Your red, your green, and your blue part of your image, depending on which mode you're working in. That will also show up as CYMK if you're working with CYMK colors. We also have a couple of other options in here, and that is the ability to create new fill or adjustment layers. So we can click here, and now we can add a solid color, gradient, pattern, levels, curves, and these are things that will affect all of the layers underneath it. So the best way to really show that, and I'm using the delete key now to delete those other layers, I'm just going to draw something up really quick for a demonstration so we can see how this sort of works. I'm just going to use the gradient tool here to create sort of an image to work with. Okay, now we have that right there. And I'm going to go ahead and just copy that. And I'm going to change this opacity level to 50% up at the top. Of course, we can't really tell that it's changed because we still have this background layer. But if we take a look, you can see that it is 50%. We can see the transparency behind it. Well, I'm going to go ahead and change this color just a little. And the easiest way to do that is just Control I, which is going to invert it. But actually, that will give us sort of a gray look. Undo that. Image adjustment. And we can adjust the color really quick. And go to hue and saturation. I just want to change the color of this so that we have a blend between those two layers, just to show that it affects both layers and not just one. So come back down to those options, and I'm going to select levels. Now we can adjust the levels of all these different layers, and normally levels would only affect just one layer. If we went to image and adjustments for this, I'm going to click OK. And now we have levels as a layer. So normally what we do to adjust levels is go to image, adjustments, and levels. But what this will actually do, right now we can see that there's no histogram because we have a levels layer selected. But if I had one of these bottom ones selected, we would see that histogram, and it would only edit that specific layer. Well, right now we can create more layers. I can go ahead and duplicate this one, and these are all being affected by this levels layer. And this works with lots of different modifiers too. It's not just levels, but we can also add hue and saturation. So I can change the color of all of our layers. Click OK. So now it's running levels, and then after levels, it'll run hue and saturation and change our colors. And we can also invert. So it'll invert all of these layers and not just one specific one. But it's not actually affecting the layers. It's just the display of the layers. So it's a good way to run through if you have multiple layers that you want to go through and you don't maybe want to fully change them and you want to preserve their original states. This way you could go into the layers panel and just add those modifiers without having to actually modify the image. We can also run a photo filter on there. Click OK. So there's lots of different options we have there. And with our other panels down here, we can add a vector mask if we want to. And this actually added another one onto our modifier because our modifiers are actually running as masks. But we could add a vector mask onto any one of these and then, of course, edit that. And I'll get into more masks a little bit later. We also have the ability to add a layer style. And these are just defaults. We could just go to the blending options, which is layer style, where we could add drop shadow, inner shadow. And I'll go over that in depth a little bit later. But that's also available really quickly on the bottom here. And then what we can also do is link our layers, which is this last one right here. So in other words, if we want to move, if we know that, let's create some text layers. And I'm just going to type in asileFX twice and have two separate text layers. And now let's say that these are always going to be in place right next to each other, and I don't want to have to shift and select both of these every single time I want to move both of those. I can right mouse click, go to link layers, and now whenever I select either one of these layers, it will move the linked layers with it. So that also works. I mean, it doesn't just work with text, you can do it with anything. So I could also add a link. So I select these two, hold down Control, select another layer, right mouse click, and link layers. So now we have three of them selected. So this is going to move a background image along with the text, so we can see that going. So with any one of these selected, all three will be selected. So that's a neat thing to have when you can link layers, and I can just right mouse click and I can select link layers and then right mouse click and unlink layers. So now they're all back individual, so we can edit them by themselves and not with the other layers. And that's pretty much our layers panel. And so there's a lot we can do with the layers panel, and we'll go a little more in depth with it a little bit later as we start sort of working on things. So I'm just going to kind of move this back, And I'm going to close this out, not going to save. And let's move on to the next part of Photoshop.